Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for day number 2 of the 2025 Mid-Season Invitational, round number 1 in the main stage. We covered, of course, the first day yesterday. We've covered all the play-in series on this channel, so it's time to jump into the series we got yesterday. We don't need a big intro. You guys know why you're here. You know what you are here to watch, AL versus FlyQuest, and so let's go ahead and get into the content. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in the series that we got last night, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game of the series, and at the end of the series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We'll be updating the bracket, talking about where these teams are looking at their next matchups, going forward, either in round 2 or in lower bracket round 1, and then, again, kind of previewing the matchup that we are getting tomorrow. But most of today will be spent talking about the series that we just had, the best of 5 that we just played. So without further ado, let's get into the content itself. Again, you guys know the intro by now. You know how it goes. Let's get into talking about a matchup between the number 1 seed from the LPL in Anyone's Legend and the number 1 seed from the LTA in FlyQuest. Obviously, a very fun matchup on paper between these two teams. A lot of trash has already been talked between, a couple of these players and just generally, these two organizations. Blippo has made it very clear that he's really excited to face off against Flandra in the top lane, and I think that there are a couple of interesting matchups here to talk about. AL are obviously coming into this as pretty big favorites just because they're the number 1 seed from the LPL. You would imagine that no matter how good a team from North America is, they shouldn't be able to compete with the champions from China. And I think that's generally, what I'm expecting to happen in this series. I do want to make it clear that I said in my video yesterday, and I said in my preview video, or my preview segment at the end of the play-ins, that I do think this series is the closest of the round 1 matchups in terms of the difference between these two teams, and that doesn't really have anything to do with AL. It has more to do with FlyQuest, but one of the reasons I could see AL struggling a bit more here is because their most consistent players on their roster don't have the highest mechanical ceilings in the world. You're looking at players like Hope, even a player like KL down in the support position that I really like. They're not exactly like the pinnacle of mechanical prowess. They're very good players. They're incredibly talented, but they're not Elk. You know what I mean? It's not the same as going up against Ruler or Elk or, even Gumayushi over for T1. These players are much more stable, but they also can sometimes be outplayed by players who are just a little bit more mechanically skillful. And one thing that Fly really does have going for them is that they're very smart at being able to slow the pace of games down. They're very good at extending games. I would argue that it's the thing they're the absolute best at, and they're really good at team fighting. They're really capable of winning in the late game, and they have a really good idea of what they want to do macro-wise in that stage of the game as well. And so when you're looking at AL, you're kind of hoping that you get big performances from players like Hope, from players like KL to kind of go out and prove that they can just outplay and outperform North American competition, that they can be, a step above like we would naturally expect from players in the LPL. But the most important piece for AL for me is still going to be Tarzan in the jungle. A lot of their success is still going to be predicated on the fact that he can go out there and win, especially in the early game. When you're looking at this matchup from AL's perspective, what they need to do is put their foot on the gas as quickly as possible. FlyQuest has one gigantic weakness, and it's their early game. They're just not a particularly good early game team. They're very good at stalling games out and making sure that the enemy team doesn't, have a ton of avenues to, blow the game wide open. But if AL can get a lot of these picks, if they can force skirmishes in the mid game that actually do open up their map states, I do think that's going to be the way that they get their biggest advantages in these games. And so Tarzan's going to be the biggest part of that. Shanks is going to be a big part of that, but you've got a lot of players here making their international debuts. Shanks, obviously the famous one, playing for a long time on WE, never got to an international tournament, and he finally does here on AL. But KL, also a player who has never been to an international tournament before. Hope, Tarzan, Flandra, all very experienced, or at least have had, deep runs at international tournaments before, but those two players need to step up here today. And for FlyQuest, when you're looking at answers on the other side, their playstyle is very predictable, but it really works for them because all of their players really buy in to that style. I would say that they're just like a better version of what we've been talking about with G2 for a lot of this year, where if G2 just chose to buy into this idea that they could play a little bit slower and play for late game team fights, I do believe that team would be more successful. But this team is just really, really in on the idea that Inspired can kind of do whatever he wants in the mid game. He can either create advantages for himself or for, mid lane or bot lane or whoever, right? Like he can do that. He also doesn't have to do that. that. He can play really slow. He can play for these team fights. They can go down 1k gold, and generally they feel comfortable doing so because they trust their ability to play the map a lot more consistently than whoever they're going into. Now, is that going to be the case going into a team like Anyone's Legend, who I do think has a great sense of map control, has a really good mid-game setup, and generally does a great job of being able to push tempo? I think it's going to be harder. I don't love the matchup in general for Fly, but if they can do their thing, like if they're talented enough to be able to, play their own style, then yeah, they're going to be able to win these games. All they have to do is go out and execute, and that's really going to leave up to these players to actually mechanically perform in the face of an Anyone's Legend team that is very talented. If you have players like Inspired that can come out and genuinely match Tarzan, where if he can go neutral in the early and in the mid game, I think he theoretically even is a better team fighter in the back half of the game. I love Tarzan, but that's where Inspired really shines as a player. Players like Quad, I think, have been very good in lane early on at being able to generate leads. If he can go even with Shanks, FlyQuest is probably more proficient at playing around their mid lane in team fight situations. Bwipo has talked a lot of trash about being able to go up against Flandra and, feeling like this is the matchup he wanted the most at MSI. So I'm excited to see that. Masu and Busio, while they've had their ups and downs, I think have a lot going for them here. Hope and KL, like I said, are kind of the players that have been more stable, like higher floor, lower ceiling type of players, even if I don't necessarily think that entirely, encompasses them anymore. I do think you're looking at someone like Masu, who has a pretty low floor, but a pretty high ceiling. We saw what he could do internationally last year against Gen G, where his team fighting was spectacular, and Busio was my MVP in North America this year. So Fly do have things going for them that I think, give them a reason to believe they can take a game or two. If they take anything more than that, that's going to be stunning. I don't think Fly wins this series. I don't think they're good enough to win this series. Do I think they're the best team in the West? Yes. Do I think AL is one of the best teams in the world? Also, yes. Right now, I would put them either number 2 or number 3, depending on just where you want to put, Hanwha Life, who's not even at this tournament because they shit the bed in the best of 5s. But the only way to know how this series ends up going and whether or not either of these teams can live up to their own expectations is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was FlyQuest. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0. And honestly, this was a phenomenal game number 1 from Fly. And honestly, a pretty good game number 1 from AL. This was just a really good showcase of two very talented teams here at MSI. I know a lot of people were talking coming off of yesterday with Gen G and G2, are these teams just not all that ready to be playing in round number 1? A lot of the teams that had buys might not be quite as practiced as the teams that came in through the play-in stage. The level and the quality of gameplay was a little bit lower than people were expecting yesterday. That completely flipped here in game number 1. This is the best game of the tournament so far, just in terms of raw, actual gameplay, because I think both teams came out with some really great ideas. It was just FlyQuest's execution in these fights that was a little bit better, and this is encouraging. I know I'm a bit of a glazer for North America right now, but that's genuinely because I do believe this region is very good at the current moment, the 3rd best in the world, if I really had to, say so myself. I've been pretty vocal about that, and I think Fly is the biggest reason for that. The execution in these fights was gorgeous. They had a really great game plan, and I think they did a really good job of executing on it. Now, for Anyone's Legend on the other side, there are a lot of things to criticize. There are 2 players in particular that I think played really bad in this game. 3, really, if you want to include the entire bot lane in that equation. But there were also players on the team that I think had great games. Tarzan was awesome in this game number 1. It just didn't really end up mattering because Fly was better in a couple of key areas. So as per usual, let's go ahead and talk about draft. First and foremost, pretty even draft, I would say, for both of these teams. Ironically enough, even with Xayah and Rumble on the side of AL, I would think that they would have less damage in the back half of the game. Xin Zhao Talia as a mid-jungle duo is going to be a bit more difficult to execute on in these team fights than Pantheon and Orianna, especially if you can get gold on Ori in the early game, and then you're matching hyper carry Xayah with Senna, who's just going to keep getting souls over and over again. You have a Galio to try and shut down the Rumble early game. Spoiler alert, that only kind of works because Bwipo dies at level 1, just getting invaded and being over aggressive. Not the first nor the last time he will ever do that in his career, I promise you that. But for FlyQuest in general, I think they understand that, yeah, we want to get the scaling advantage, and they're not necessarily losing throughout a lot of the mid game either. Does AL spike maybe a tad bit harder? I think you can make the argument that that's the case because you're playing around Xin Zhao Talia, but you're also playing around Pantheon Galio on FlyQuest, and you have a lot of ways to actually be able to push that tempo as well. It was really going to come down to which jungle jungler could get a big advantage here, and both of them played great. Inspired and Tarzan both had absolutely phenomenal games. I think both of them, clearly showing that they are some of the best players in the world. What it really came down to in the back half of this game in terms of team fighting was just the bot lane being better for FlyQuest. Masu's going to get player of the game for me on the Senna. I'm not joking, like there was just a bot gap in terms of actual performance and production in game number 1. Masu and Busio were so clean in these 5v5s, Busio with those engages and just being able to find really creative angles to set up the rest of his team, and Masu just perfect positioning, maximum damage output. I mean, Senna's a ridiculously strong champion, but we've seen a lot of teams at this tournament not use Senna particularly well or effectively because it's very difficult to be able to get the souls necessary on that champion to be as useful as you need to be in team fights. Masu felt so comfortable on Senna. This team has found a ton of success on this champion, not only this year, but last year as well, and this is the example of why teams are picking it, because when Senna works, like when she gets to just play front to back in these team fights and gets to take over because her range is crazy long and her damage is crazy high, it's very tough to end up stopping her. But Masu had to outplay Hope and KL and Flandra to an extent in order to get into that position. It's just lucky that he was able to do so. So credit to Masu, credit to Busio, who I thought had a tremendously good game here on the Rel. I don't know if he's going to get enough credit for how well he played. That's kind of been his story throughout the entire year up until this point. I think he's been the best player in North America, or at least the most valuable for FlyQuest. Inspired probably is still the most talented player, but Busio's been incredible, and he was once again very, very good here. KL has a strong argument to be made right now that he's the most productive support in the world. Across the beginning of 2025, Busio completely outplayed him in every single aspect of the game, especially in the 5v5s. This bot lane really stepped up. Like I said, Inspired looked incredible in this game. A lot of really aggressive plays, and that was not because Tarzan was kind of letting him have a lot of these advantages. Tarzan with some great plays, specifically the invade to kill, or I guess the counter invade to kill Inspired when he was taking red buff. That was really well played and a very smart rotation there by Tarzan. And I think the Xin Zhao was actively just everywhere he wanted to be on the map. Inspired was just even more active than the Xin Zhao, and the team fighting in particular was just really solid. The target prioritization, the ability to juggle aggro, really impressive stuff from Inspired. This is like top of the line level gameplay coming in from Inspired, Masu, and Busio. And that's not to disparage Quad or Bwipo, although, Bwipo dying his only death of the entire game at level 1 because he just stands there, he flashes over the wall for no reason on the Galio and ends up getting put really far behind only to win lane anyways, because Galio into Rumble is already an incredibly difficult matchup for the Rumble. That happened to Bwipo. Shout out to him. It doesn't really matter if he dies at level 1 if he can stay useful throughout the rest of the game, but Quad also really solid. A couple of nice shockwaves. He was much more of an ancillary piece here for Fly, but it's great gameplay. Like, I just want to stress that this wasn't AL rolling over. AL tried their best here and Fly was just better. And then for AL on the other side, like, there were a couple of things that I think were great. Like I said, Tarzan had a phenomenal game. I think he tried his absolute best on Xin Zhao to do something. Shanks I thought was totally fine here on the Talia, although he could have output a bit more damage and optimized a bit more in terms of his positioning in some of these fights, but it was everybody else that I think had some bad moments. KL is definitely going to get dud of the game for me. Those team fights were horrible, and I know there are some people online talking about just, KL was linking up with Tarzan and made a couple of nice plays early. For sure, man. Like, if you're gonna run the team fights like as badly as KL did, though, I just can't overlook that. He was the worst player in the stretch of this game, and that is not acceptable. If he's gonna get gapped by Busio, that's a problem, and if Hope is gonna get gapped by Masu in the way that he was in this game, that's also going to be a pretty major problem. Hope was not relevant really at any point in terms of what he was able to do damage-wise, and you look at this comp, it's all really set up for Xayah to be able to play in the late game once the Xin Zhao and the Talia have a gold lead, which never really came to fruition in this one, but Hope's positioning was really bad. KL's engages were horrible in the back end of the game. Flandra missed basically every equalizer in the back half of this game as well. Again, I understand, and I want to make it clear, this is a tough game for Rumble to end up playing. This is a much easier game to play through Xin Zhao and Talia, at least through the middle of the map, because Orianna's not going to have that same kind of the roam presence than it is for something like Rumble to take over. That's why Xayah is so important overall to the comp, but I will say for Flandra, like, you gotta at least try to land something. He ended up being really useless this game, and if Tarzan's trying to 1v9, or I guess 2v8 if you really want to put Shanks in that conversation as well, that's not enough. AL needs to be better, and Fly was, more talented in a couple of key areas. This is why I said that this series was going to be closer than people thought, because I don't think the individual talent gap of these players is all that different. I think AL is likely going to be able to rebound from this and have better macro throughout a lot of this series, but Fly has shown that they deserve to be taken seriously a lot more so than people were giving them credit for coming into this. So, is Fly going to be able to take that 2-0 series lead and actually show show that it's not just they need to be taken seriously, like they could genuinely be a top 4 team in the world? Or is anyone's legend going to be able to bounce back, showcase that it's just game number 1? You know, we had a couple of performances that maybe weren't ideal, but we're going to clean things up. Well, the winner of game number 2 was anyone's legend. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up the series at 1 apiece, and this was a much better game from AL in general. I think the coin kind of flipped in the other direction in this one where, you know, as much as I like how FlyQuest played in game 1, it was clear that they were outclassed in game 2. Again, specifically one lane that I think a lot of people are going to be pointing to, a very miserable top lane matchup here for Fly, and they end up just being in a very bad spot because of it, but credit to AL for actually going out and performing well in those instances. Of course, we talk about draft. You know, AL's got a weird draft here. I think that they have a couple of things going for them. I don't think it feels particularly consistent, but my biggest problem with Fly's draft, which I think is more of an issue here, is first off, I think, you know, the Mordekaiser Yorick, you know, matchup is just not what he thinks it is. He learned on stream, and people have pointed this out pretty consistently. He learned on stream like a couple of days ago that Maiden does follow you into the Mordekaiser ultimate, and so he does know that that happens. I don't think this is a good matchup for Mordekaiser. I think that there are some ways to consider this positive for Mord overall, but I think Yorick wins the 1v1, which I think we saw for the most part. Even if Bwipo landed his skill shots, which, by the way, he didn't land any of his damage throughout a lot of these fights, but even if he does, I think it's very difficult for Yorick to actually be beaten in a lot of these 1v1s, but even on top of that, I just don't really know what the Mord actually does the later this goes down into the game, and so you've got R3 Mordekaiser as the answer to Yorick, whatever, it didn't work out. You've also got R1 Victor, which I think just makes you a tad bit more passive, especially because you're picking Victor Vi as your mid-jungle duo. Essentially, what you're creating here is a mid-game power spike comp that doesn't really spike all that hard, that can't really match the pressure of Yorick in a side lane, plus Ryze potentially in a side lane, plus, you know, Corki and Nico and a lot of these playmakers coming out. Like, you have a ton of ways to do things for AL, and I don't really know Fly ever has that, you know, in the same way. I think you're looking at potentially Vi plus Kalista being able to win a lot of fights in the mid-game, and if you can get Masu into a good spot, that could be a theoretical win condition for you, because I don't think you're winning fights in the late game against Corki, against Ryze, against a Yorick split push, especially if they start choosing to 1-3-1. But even on top of that, like, if that's what you're playing for, then why are you picking Victor on R1? There are other things available that I think could offer you similar positives that don't necessarily give you the downside of having to be a lot less mobile and a lot less active in the mid game. It just feels disconnected for me when it comes to Fly's draft, and I think it's a bit of ego, especially from Bwipo, which again is going to be the theme of this game, you know, for this to be the draft for Fly in game number 2. And AL, to their credit, had to still go out and execute and play it well, and they did exactly that. Come on, player of the game's Flandra. You don't need me to tell you that. Solo kills Bwipo at level 2. Bwipo hits level 2 first, but then misses every single ability that he tries to go for. Flandra just stands there and keeps auto-attacking and ends up killing him. That's pretty bad, but it's not like game-breaking for Bwipo. He can survive this, like he can come back. Yorick is just up now. He just has to play a little bit safer. Goes for it again at I think level 6 or level 7 or around there. Ends up getting absolutely blasted because I guess he just forgot the mechanic for Yorick, and by that point the game is over for Bwipo. And getting solo killed twice is not very good, but it is very good for Flandra, and you do have to give him credit. He still had to play those fights well. He still had to be able to sidestep a lot of the damage coming in from the Mordekaiser. Bwipo made it pretty easy for him to do so, but he still had to go out there and execute on it. So credit to Flandra. His Yorick has been unstoppable throughout this year. There are actually a couple of champions that I think you just can't give over to AL. Yorick is one of them. Sion and Ornn have unironically been others on the top side, because when this guy is on Peel, when he's on like frontline tanks, he's like one of the best players in the world at the current moment. So Flandra just reasserting himself as one of the best top laners in the world, like we already kind of knew throughout how he'd been playing for a lot of 2025. But I also want to give a big shout out to Tarzan. I thought this was another very good game from him, this time on the Trundle. As much as we can talk about top lane kind of spiraling out of control, you still have to win elsewhere on the map. You still have to be able to turn that advantage. Top lane, the least relevant lane in terms of actively being able to transfer power. You still have to be able to transfer that power to the rest of the team and be able to fight it out from there. And I think Tarzan did a great job allowing the Yorick to be a lot more aggressive in terms of where he wanted to push, and, you know, kind of setting up plays where FlyQuest was losing no matter what they ended up doing. Tarzan's setups are just absolutely gorgeous. It's the reason I've always loved him as a player, the reason I call him the best jungler in the world right now, because I think his setups are really just that that consistent. So Yorick Trundle kind of taking over here. Credit to KL, horrible game number 1, much better game number 2 here on the Nico. Hope was along for the ride. He has not really done anything at all throughout this series up until this point. Shanks was fine on the rise of being able to match and especially help out Tarzan in terms of a lot of these setups, but really the story of this game is top lane and Flandra just completely diffing Bwipo, and that's why Bwipo is also dud of the game on the other side. Again, you don't really need me to go into depth on why Bwipo is dud of the game. This was a miserable performance from him. I'm not going to say he single-handedly lost his team the game, but he certainly did like 80% of the work in terms of getting FlyQuest into a bad spot here. Not only is Mordekaiser unplayable from behind, he's already a champion that is a very niche counterpick, and he's not a counterpick to Yorick, despite what Bwipo's video on, you know, whatever YouTube channel will actually tell you. This is not actually a very good matchup anymore now that Maiden follows you into the Mordekaiser ultimate, and Bwipo, I think, again, learned that the hard way. He already can't trade with this Yorick early. I don't even really know why he went for the level 2 all-in terms of that fight. If Yorick hits level 2, even if Mord hits those abilities and Yorick doesn't sidestep, I don't know if Mord wins that. Like, I genuinely do not know. I think Yorick is in a really good spot to just be able to fight that out, and I think it's just a lack of understanding. It's Bwipo, you know, I mean this entirely respectfully, because I know I have a bunch of Bwipo fans in my comment section, and they're going to get real mad at me when I say stuff like this, but Bwipo can sometimes get to a spot, and this is his biggest weakness. He is his own biggest enemy, where he thinks he's 7,000 IQ, and, you know, sometimes he is, sometimes his really great strategies work, but he constantly is in that zone. He constantly thinks that he's outsmarting everyone on the Rift, which means that when he's not, he ends up being more of a nuisance to his team, because he can't really step back and say that I'm not relevant in the game, and that's kind of what we saw here. This was a 7,000 IQ counterpick that ended up turning into a game-losing pick for FlyQuest. And again, I like Bwipo. I think he's been super valuable to Fly, but that inconsistency has always been with him as a player. It's gotten even worse since he's come over to North America, and I do believe that that ended up really costing them here. Masu and Busio also had a much weaker game in game 2 than they did in game number 1, but like really, how much can you blame anyone else on this team? I don't think even inspired Masu, Busio, I don't think any of them really played all that bad. Busio had a couple of, you know, positioning mistakes in team fights especially that ended up being big problems. Masu wasn't very protected in this game, but really, what are they supposed to do? Top lane's already losing. You're a comp that spikes in the mid game, but your mid game spike isn't even really as strong as the enemy's mid game spike, and you don't have gold on any priority targets. It's a very difficult game to win for Fly, and they ended up just kind of bleeding out in this one. This felt more like what we expected, with AL just having more priority, winning a lane incredibly hard, but, you know, Fly has shown that if they get to play a game neutrally from 15 minutes onwards, they're actually in a pretty good spot to be able to win those. They just have to get there. They kind of bled an advantage too quick in this game and ended up being unplayable. Can they bounce back in game 3? This is, as you guys know, in my opinion, the most important game of the series, regardless of the score, especially though at 1-1. If you can win that game 3, go up 2-1 in a series, things get a lot easier. So is Fly going to be able to bounce back, or will AL take full control of this series? Well, the winner of game number 3 was anyone's legend. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go up for the first time in this series 2-1, and they're going to do it pretty interestingly. I don't want to sit here and say that it was easy, because it certainly was not for them, but I do think they played to their win condition just a tad bit better. I think FlyQuest actually had a pretty fantastic game, and these team fights were incredibly close. I want to make something abundantly clear for those of you who are going to trash on Fly, or who are going to look at, you know, a 2-1, and, you know, I'm not going to spoil how the rest of this series goes, but who are going to look at results throughout this series and say that this is in any way comparable to G2 versus Gen G. I just can't agree with that. This game 3 was super close, and honestly really could have been won by FlyQuest if they had just a bit more firepower in the back half of this game from their draft, but they didn't. They went for proactivity, they went for playmaking, and it kind of took the onus out of their own hands to play the things that they are good at. You know, there's not a lot left up on the board that would really play towards their win condition that they really like, and so I am going to give them a bit of slack in that regard, but AL had a better team fighting comp, and they came out and just barely won a lot of these team fights, end up getting Chemsol, and the game is gone from there. So let's talk about it. Draft, you know, as we start here, FlyQuest really wants to make plays around the map. You don't draft Twisted Fate on B1 unless you are attempting to be proactive in the early game. The problem is AL just answers and they say, Wukong is here. And I think the more important thing here is the Varus on R1. I've been super vocal on this channel throughout all of this year, really, even going back to parts of last year where I'm just, Varus is so much better than every AD carry in the game right now. There is no ADC that does what Varus does. at the level that he's capable of doing it. He's good in every part of the game. He's a good early game, laner. He can definitely play in the 2v2 depending on the matchup. He's a very good team fighter. He can play for skirmishes. He's just an all-around very good AD carry, the best in the game right now. To allow AL to have Varus on R1, I think is just unacceptable, because Hope has honestly been the liability on anyone's Legend so far in this series. He has not been as good as Masu. Masu has been better on the other side. I would argue that even in this game, Masu was better on the other side of this on Jhin. It just didn't really matter because Varus has so many more options in the back half of this game. I think that's where things ended up going wrong, but I also do think the Twisted Fate is just bait. I've said it over and over again on this channel. I don't get it. I don't understand why everybody is going to TF right now. I get that it's doing really well in solo queue on the patch that they're playing on here, but it's a completely different reason for it being good in solo queue. First off, the timers in solo queue are a lot less rigid, and so TF's cooldown on his ult is not necessarily as relevant in solo queue as it is in pro play. Like, yes, you can make a ton of plays on the map more consistently than even things like Ryze or Galio or whatever, because the ult is on a shorter cooldown, but TF does, and I mean this, absolutely nothing in fights. Like, he is just a complete zero once you get into the 5v5 section of the game, and that is very difficult. He is gold card, and that is it. He does no damage. He's not really able to be all that useful because gold card is kind of difficult to pull off without putting yourself in a ridiculous amount of danger, especially on anything that's actually a priority target. You really have to go for a lot of these creative flanks. I just don't get the TF priority. It's been like banned the most of any champion at this tournament, and teams feel comfortable picking it on B1. I really do believe that teams are losing games because of TF. Has it won a single game at this tournament so far? I think it's 0-4 in terms of the games it's been played in, and it's kind of looked like the liability in all of those games. At some point, we have to learn to adapt, but it's not the only thing that I don't like about Fly's draft. I do like Inspired on Viego. This is, in my opinion, his best champion. It's always been his best champion. I think Lilia is right up there with, Viego in terms of what he's able to play, but just the consistency that he always has here. Sometimes he overplayed himself in team fights, but I think it was fine. If you're going to go for Twisted Fate, you need to go for a higher damage bot laner, but honestly, Jhin is totally fine as a champion. People on Reddit love to complain about AD carries not doing enough damage because they expect them to be #1 in terms of damage every single game, no matter what, no matter the situation. Jhin is perfectly fine and can be a pretty big damage option in team fights. It is the Twisted Fate that is the problem in this draft. And I love the Cho'Gath on the top side. I think not only does it beat the Scion early on, it's going to scale incredibly well. It's going to be pretty consistent frontline to be able to eat up Azir damage and Varus damage throughout the back half of the game. My only question is, why did you not pick this into the Yorick in game number 2? That would have been a significantly better play. But, that's really my biggest complaint about Fly's draft here. Is just, I don't think TF did a lot, and you can see it. Quad's dead of the game. I don't think the TF was useful. But for AL, it's their mid laner who ends up coming out on top. You have these teams kind of coming down to the wire, coming down to these 5v5 team fights that are really close, like incredibly back and forth. There were moments where it felt like Fly was generating leads and moments where it felt like AL was generating leads, but it came down to the fact that Shanks was on Azir and nobody was going to be able to match the Azir in the late game, and that's why Shanks is getting player of the game. He played these fights really well. His spacing and positioning is really good, and he knows when to be aggressive. I think, I call it LEC Azir syndrome on this channel all the time, but all these players that fall into the trap of feeling like they need to be the primary playmaker on Azir with the ultimate, he was very happy to sit back and do damage. And I think a lot of times, especially when you're the #1 damage source on your team, just do that, man. Like, just be the AD carry, you know what I mean? Play really safe and just, output a bunch of damage front to back, and that's exactly what he did. You have a ton of engage elsewhere on this team. You have Wukong, who's the best teamfight engage in the entire game. You have, Braum and Scion, who can just sit there in front to back very easily. You have Varus ultimate to peel. Like, there are a ton of different ways to play this out without the Azir needing to be the superstar, and yet Shanks was, willing to step up and do a lot of the damage. I really love how Shanks played this game. I continue to believe that Tarzan is playing a lot better than his KDAs would indicate in this series. Philandra had another really nice game, this time on the Scion. I said it in the previous game, but Ornn, Scion, those tanks top lane that he can play for 5v5s, he's really thrived on those throughout 2025, which is cool to see, because that's not the reputation he gets. Really, the only complaint I have for AL is that Hope is really not playing well. His positioning is really not great. His laning is certainly not great. I think there's been a lot of problems today, and hopefully that gets fixed moving forward, because I think Hope is the kind of player that you're hoping can step up throughout this series, but AL didn't really need him in this game. They just were able to win anyways. And for Fly, I do want to give them a lot of credit, because look at this comp. Look at the Cho'Gath, Viego, Twisted Fate, Jhin, Alistar comp, and tell me why they won a bunch of team fights, or at least stayed neutral in a lot of team fights throughout this game. It's because their execution really is that damn good. If they had, like, actual team fight threats, I think they probably win this game number 3. Like, again, call it copium, call it whatever you want. I really do think that they played that well in game 3, and you can give a lot of credit to a couple of different players. I think that Bwipo had a much better game in Game 3. The Cho'Gath was relevant. I think it could have been more relevant as the game went on. Inspired played a couple of these fights so gorgeously, but the problem is he had to overextend in a lot of them because it's really difficult to try to play front to back with Viego as your primary damage dealer, and so he felt like he needed to try and dive in and get those resets as quickly as possible. The problem was there's a ton of CC, and so some people might look at that and be like, Inspired's inting, and he's running it down in these fights. I don't really see any other way for him to be able to play any of these fights because the team is set up in a way where they need to get Viego those resets as early as possible. Masu was there for secondary damage, and I still think the Jhin was a big problem in these team fights. It's just really hard for Jhin to be your #1 damage dealer when you're going up against Azir Varus, and especially against a Wukong where it's really easy to be able to disrupt that Jhin. I think Busio was fine. Again, the KDA is not great, but Quad is getting dead of the game, not because he individually made a ton of mistakes or that he was outpositioned or anything like that, but rather just because the Twisted Fate wasn't doing anything in the back half of the game. I was really disappointed with this pick when it came through, and I think it really ended up biting them in the butt. But now they're down 2-1. They are one game away from going down to lower bracket, despite playing so well in the series up until this point, kind of proving me right in saying that the series was going to be closer than people thought it was going to be. Are they going to really prove that by taking this to a Silver Scrapes Game 5, or is AL going to be able to close this out after generating their own lead? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Anyone's Legend. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to take this series 3-1. And we finally had a game where it just felt like AL was better. Now, part of this is not FlyQuest's fault. I would say actually all of it is FlyQuest's fault. Part of it is not the player's fault, or at least the gameplay's fault, because this draft is in a very bad spot. Just coming out of draft, like it's going to be pretty difficult to win this. Not only are you basically full magic damage outside of Lee Sin because you're Ahri Ziggs in terms of your carry duo, you're going into a Poppy when you're playing Lee Sin Ahri, which makes things very tough. You have a mid-game power spike comp that doesn't really have any way to teamfight in the late game, which plays against what your team is already good at, and you're taking the one player that's consistently been able to outperform his opponent on the other side of this matchup throughout this series in Masu, and putting him on a champion in Ziggs that's not really going to be able to play the game here. So, you know, I think a lot went wrong for Fly in draft. I honestly do believe that gameplay-wise they were able to keep up with AL in this series, but, you know, this is what happens. This is the Tabe difference, right, that everybody keeps talking about on Reddit and in my comments section, where it's just, you know, go to drafts and consistently wins. Like, it's just kind of how it goes. For AL, I do think they played this game great. They still had to go out there and execute. If Fly got a lead early, there is a way for them to be able to wallet diff as this game continues to go along, but AL didn't really allow that to happen. I know we're looking at 3 winning lanes, better scaling, and a pretty good matchup chart for AL, but you still have to go out there and execute, and that's exactly what they did. I've already kind of gone over draft. Like, what do you do if you're FlyQuest in this game? If it's neutral at 10 minutes, I actually think this game is just doomed. Ahri and Ziggs can't really play. Ahri is already a pick that I'm kind of calling bait. I don't think it's as good as a lot of people make it out to be. Ziggs is unpickable in this situation. So is Lee Sin, to be quite frank. I love Lee Sin. I've been a big fan of his on this patch. In fact, yesterday I talked about how this champion is underplayed at this tournament up until this point. Yeah, this ain't the game, Chief. This is not the situation to be picking Lee Sin. If you had other pieces surrounding this that could potentially be, you know, primary damage dealers in the late game, then yeah, maybe Lee Sin can be the pick, but you know, Nautilus, Ziggs, Lee Sin, what is that first rotate? What is that first, you know, 3 picks? Like, what are we doing? Like, I just don't understand. The Shen top lane is a complete waste. It's not very good into Mbessa early because Mbessa is just gonna have way more combat power. You're using it to be able to ult in the late game, but like, what team fight are you winning? Like, you know what I mean? What team fight is Shen ult actually gonna make the difference in when your primary damage dealer is Ziggs in the back half of this game? Like, it's just not gonna happen, man. Like, there's no synergy across FlyQuest comp, and I think they have 3 losing lanes because Aurora should outpressure Ahri. Mbessa definitely outpressure Shen in the 1v1, and Lucian is obviously going to have push into Ziggs as well, or not push, but at least combat pressure into Ziggs. So what are you playing for? Like, what even is the advantage for Fly in this game? It's just unplayable, and AL took advantage of it. And you know what? Shanks had a gorgeous game here. He's going to get player of the game. He's also going to get player of the series for me as a whole because of game 3 and game 4, the Azir and the Aurora back-to-back. This team has been the best Aurora team in the world. Shanks has been the best Aurora player in the world so far in 2025. We talked about that in my primer video, where it's just kind of unfair when this team gets this champion. I believe he is now 11-0 on Aurora so far in 2025, a pretty good record all things considered, but Shanks stepping up. He had some question marks in game number 1. He wasn't exactly perfect in terms of how he played that game out. It's nice to see him be able to kind of rebound and push forward in games 3 and 4. I do believe he was the most relevant player in this series. I do also want to give a big shout out to Hope. This was his best game of the series by far as well. Like, he had really been getting outplayed by Masu super consistently, but his early game was awesome here. He finally actually played like the Hope that we know, where he can step up and just generate leads and be super consistent in that phase of the game. Of course, having Masu on Ziggs definitely helps things, but it is worth noting that Hope actually did go out and play well. Flandra was, again, really solid. He completely gapped Whippo, especially in game 2, obviously, but game 4 here, I think this was also a pretty big Flandra gap in terms of just what he was able to set up individually as a player. You know, KL was fine on the Leona, couple of nice engages. Tarzan, ironically, probably had his weakest game of the entire series here, just from a pure individual perspective, but that's maybe just because I'm grading him on a curve. Not only is he Tarzan, but also he's playing Poppy into Lee Sin in a jungle matchup, and you're also playing against Ahri, and you get to build full MR because it's Ahri Ziggs as the carry duo. This should be an Omega Poppy game. It should be unplayable for anybody trying to play into that champ, but it ended up not really being all that dominant. It was really everybody else on the team that made a gigantic impact. But AL looking pretty solid. You know, as much as I've been hyping up FlyQuest, like, AL outplayed them in this series, even if Fly actually did play well. So credit to anyone's legend. They deserve to be moving on to round 2. We'll kind of talk about what I think the future of their tournament could look like moving forward. But for FlyQuest, you know, I think they were fine today. I think every draft that was playable for them, they looked competitive. The only 2 games that they didn't have, you know, competitive games, game 2 was a Mordekaiser diff on the top side where he just couldn't play the game and it was a 4v5, and then game 4 was unplayable from a draft perspective. Games 1 and 3 were both incredibly tense and close, and even then I think game 3 was a bit of a draft diff in favor of anyone's legend. The one game where I think Fly actually had a neutral draft that they could play out from an okay game state was a win for them, and so I think if they're able to clean up those draft phases, if they're able to start playing to the win condition that they know that they have a bit more, like, who's to say they can't compete to be a top 4 or top 5 team in the world? I really do believe they have that kind of talent. It just wasn't showcased in this series. Masu's going to get done of the game for game 4. You know, I get it. He put out a lot of damage in the back half of the game. His early game completely gave up any chance for FlyQuest to be able to win. Again, I get that it's a hard game to play Ziggs in, but I have to call out when your AD carry is dying 9 times in a game that's not going to be particularly valuable to you being able to play. I think Quad also deserved dud of the game. Somebody in my comment section yesterday was asking, like, why don't I give dud of the series? First of all, I think that that's just a little bit too BM. Like, I give dud of the game because I think it's fair to call out when somebody was underperforming, but dud of the series is like pointing and laughing, and I think oftentimes it's not that simple, right? Like, dud of the series doesn't really exist for the most part, where one player loses you the series. That's not really why you would ever lose a best of 5. Like, one player is not going to lose you a best of 5. Like, there is no dud of the series. I think there were a couple of candidates here, but it's more useful to me to point out, okay, Quad was worse than Shanks, Blippo was worse than Flandra. Like, those are the things that matter. The solo lanes kind of let FlyQuest down here today. The Ahri, not useful. The Shen was also completely irrelevant, as it was always going to be in a draft like this. Inspired played awesome all day, and I think Inspired has proven that my ranking of 4th for him in terms of the jungle rankings is justified, and it might even be too low. Like, this guy is a world-class player, arguably a top 10 player in the world right now in terms of what he is capable of doing. He had a phenomenal series. This game was unwinnable for him on Lee Sin, and yet he still tried. I really do think he played that well. I don't know how that's going to continue moving forward, but I do want to give him all the credit in the world. He's the best player in the West by far, and certainly he is the biggest reason why Fly is the best team in the West, in my opinion, and why they were competitive in this series. Busio couldn't really do anything. Again, his AD carry was getting caught, and the Nautilus can't really salvage that. This game was unplayable, and FlyQuest are going to be looking back and probably wishing that they had just drafted something else, because if they had even won one more game against AL, the entire narrative of this series probably shifts. But they go down to lower bracket, AL stays in upper bracket. They're going to take on Gen G up next. It's the number 1 seeds from both of these regions in round 2. Why is the bracket like this? Can anyone explain to me why LPL1 and LCK1 are on the same side? It does not make any reasonable sense to me why that would ever be the case, but that's what we got here, and so hopefully anyone's legend can keep their pressure up. They looked better in round 1 than their LCK counterpart did. I'll say that for much. All right, but that is going to do it for my MSI Round 1 Day 2 overview and analysis video. The bracket is updated up on the screen here. Of course, anyone's legend moving on to Round 2 to take on Gen G. FlyQuest moving down to the lower bracket to take on G2 Esports. I'm not previewing those here today. We will preview those when we get closer to those actual matchups that are coming later on during the weekend. But for now, we're going to finish out round number 1. Our next matchup is a very, very fun one. This is the one that every other analyst will tell you is the closest of round 1. 1. It's a matchup between the number 1 seed from the LEC in Movistar Koi and the number 2 seed from the LPL in Bilibili Gaming. I don't believe this is as close as Anyone's Legend and Fly was on paper. I kind of got that right in terms of just how well Fly played from a pure mechanics perspective. If they had human drafts, I think things would have been a little bit different. But for Koi versus BLG, I would be surprised if Koi was able to keep up. I think Bilibili's raw mechanical talent is being undersold at the moment. Do I think that this is a perfect team? Do they play off of each other perfectly? No. I think that there are still a lot of things for them to grow on, and it's why they've struggled against the best teams in the world, like Anyone's Legend domestically, but they're better than Koi. Like, there's not a single player on their team that is weaker than their opposition on the other side. The only matchup that you could potentially exploit would be Elyoya into Beichuan, and even then, like, I think Beichuan is just a better player than Elyoya is, even if that might be a bit of a controversial opinion, but, like, Bin's gonna massacre Mirwin on the top side. I don't know how anyone can say this series will be close unless they can give me a concrete reason why Mirwin's gonna be able to actually survive against Bin. Like, I love Jojo. He's super flippy and he's going up against Knight. Don't love that matchup. Elk and On have been on fire as of late. They've been a lot better than, you know, they are getting credit for, specifically On, and you're going into Supa and Alvaro, who are the stable, positive side of Koi, but, like, you know, is Supa as mechanically talented as Elk? No. Like, that, like, I don't know where you're gonna get the advantages for Koi. So for me, this is BLG 3-0. I really do believe they're gonna win this series super easily, but we'll see if that works out. I also thought Gen G would win 3-0, and G2 was still able to take a game there. We'll see if the same can be said for Koi, but let me know if you agree or disagree with that down in the comment section below. Curious to know your thoughts and opinions down there, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're covering the whole tournament as per usual on this channel every single day that there are games, round 1, round 2, all the way up till finals. And so if you want a breakdown of every single day of MSI in the way that you got it here today, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all